At some point in the last few years, things started to feel different. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to on a single day and say, that is when it changed. But gradually, quietly, and with a kind of inevitability that felt uncomfortable to examine too closely. The energy that used to carry you through a full day started to fade by mid-afternoon. The weight that never used to stick began to settle around your middle and refuse to move. The sleep that used to restore you stopped doing its job properly. The joints that never used to ache now do. The mental sharpness that you took for granted feels a little less reliable than it once did. And the explanation most people arrive at, the one that feels obvious and that nobody really challenges, is that this is simply what getting older feels like. That the body gradually winds down. That these changes are the natural, unavoidable cost of adding decades to your life. That the best you can do is manage them, accommodate them, and accept them as the price of aging. That explanation is wrong. Or more precisely, it is dangerously incomplete. Because the majority of what people attribute to normal aging, the fatigue, the weight gain, the cognitive fog, the joint inflammation, the declining hormonal function, the slow erosion of vitality, is not being caused primarily by the passage of time. It is being caused by a specific measurable biological process that is running in the background of the modern body. A process that has a name, a mechanism, and critically, a set of conditions under which it can be slowed, interrupted, and in many cases partially reversed. Aging is real, but what most people are experiencing is not aging. It is something else. And once you understand what it actually is, the path forward looks very different from simply accepting a gradual decline. Hi, I am Dr. Alex. I am an emergency medicine doctor. And after nearly 10 years working on the front line of the AANDE, I have had a perspective that most clinicians do not get, the end-stage view. I have seen what happens when the slow, invisible processes of metabolic dysfunction, chronic inflammation, and hormonal decline are left unaddressed for decades. I have seen patients in their 50s and 60s whose bodies present clinically like those of people 20 years older, and I have seen the reverse as well. People in their late 60s and 70s who are physiologically remarkable, not because of genetics, but because of what they understood about their biology and acted on early enough to make a difference. My goal now is to give people that understanding before they end up in a department like mine. To explain not just what to do, but why it works at the level of biology that most health advice never reaches. If you are watching this video, there is a good chance that something I described in the opening resonates with you. Maybe you have been quietly attributing changes in your body to aging and wondering whether there is anything to be done. I want to make you a promise. I will keep producing the most honest, most rigorously science-based content I can to help you understand your body and extend both the length and the quality of your life. All I ask in return is that you give this channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you reach the end of this video and you do not feel you learned something genuinely valuable, you are welcome to unsubscribe. No hard feelings. But if you give me your attention, I will give you everything I have learned from over a decade on the clinical front line. Please subscribe and let us get into what is actually happening. The biological process at the center of this conversation has a name that researchers now use routinely, but that has barely entered the public health conversation: inflammaging. It is a term coined to describe the low-grade, chronic, systemic inflammation that accumulates in the body with age and, more importantly, with the specific conditions of modern life. Understanding what it is and how it works is the key to understanding why so many of the experiences people attribute to aging are actually something else entirely. Inflammation is not inherently harmful. Acute inflammation is one of the body's most essential protective responses. When you cut your hand, twist your ankle, or fight off a viral infection, your immune system mounts an inflammatory response, sending immune cells to the affected area, increasing blood flow, generating heat, triggering the cellular machinery of repair. That response is time-limited, localized, and purposeful. It switches on, does its job, and switches off. That is acute inflammation, and it is a sign of a healthy immune system functioning correctly. Chronic low-grade inflammation is something fundamentally different. It is not a localized response to a specific injury or pathogen. It is a diffuse, persistent, system-wide activation of the immune system that operates at a level too low to produce obvious symptoms, but high enough to cause continuous, cumulative damage to tissues, blood vessels, organs, and cellular machinery across the entire body. It does not switch off. It simply runs quietly, invisibly, for years or decades while the damage accumulates, What makes this particularly important is the sheer breadth of the conditions it drives. Research published in Nature Medicine has identified chronic low-grade inflammation as a central contributing mechanism in cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, certain cancers, depression, osteoarthritis, and accelerated cellular aging. These are not separate diseases that happen to share a demographic. They are, in very large part, different expressions of the same underlying inflammatory burden playing out in different tissues and organ systems, but driven by the same root cause. Chronic inflammation does not feel like anything specific. That is precisely what makes it so insidious. There is no pain you can point to, no fever, no obvious symptom that flags its presence. It simply produces a gradual dimming of the biological systems that keep you feeling vital, sharp, and functional, the fatigue that feels like normal aging, the joint ache that feels like wear and tear, the cognitive fog that feels like just getting older. In a significant proportion of people, these are not aging per se, they are inflammation presenting as aging. Here is the part that changes everything. Chronic inflammation in midlife and beyond is not caused primarily by aging itself. The passage of time does increase baseline inflammatory markers to some degree, that is real. But the magnitude of the inflammatory burden most people are carrying is far beyond what the calendar alone explains. It is being driven in the majority of cases by a specific set of modifiable conditions. And identifying those conditions is where the conversation shifts from resignation to genuine possibility. The first and most significant driver is visceral fat, the fat stored deep within the abdominal cavity surrounding the organs rather than the subcutaneous fat stored just beneath the skin. Visceral fat is not metabolically inert. It is an active endocrine tissue that continuously secretes pro-inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines, specifically interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly into the bloodstream and into the portal circulation that feeds the liver. The more visceral fat a person carries, the higher their baseline inflammatory burden. Research published in Circulation has demonstrated that visceral fat is a stronger predictor of systemic inflammation and cardiovascular risk than total body weight or BMI, which is why people of apparently normal weight can carry significant inflammatory risk if their fat is predominantly visceral rather than subcutaneous. That is the first driver, visceral fat as a continuous inflammatory signal. The second driver is the gut microbiome, the community of trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that inhabit the large intestine. The gut microbiome plays a central role in regulating immune function, and a disrupted microbiome, one that is low in microbial diversity, depleted of beneficial species, and dominated by pro-inflammatory strains, promotes systemic inflammation through a process researchers call intestinal permeability, or more colloquially, a leaky gut. When the lining of the intestine becomes permeable, bacterial fragments and inflammatory molecules that should remain confined to the gut pass into the bloodstream, activating immune responses that fuel systemic inflammation. Research published in Cell has shown that microbiome diversity declines significantly with modern dietary patterns, high in ultra-processed food, low in dietary fiber, and that this decline tracks closely with rising markers of systemic inflammation in population studies. The third driver is blood glucose instability. Repeated glucose spikes from refined carbohydrates, sugar, and the kind of dietary patterns that have become standard in the developed world trigger inflammatory responses through multiple pathways. Excess glucose attaches to proteins throughout the body in a process called glycation, generating inflammatory byproducts called advanced glycation end products, or AGs. Elevated insulin, the companion hormone to repeated glucose spikes, directly promotes the production of inflammatory cytokines, and the oxidative stress generated by glucose variability damages cell membranes and blood vessel walls, amplifying the inflammatory signal further. Blood glucose instability is not just a diabetes concern, it is a central driver of the inflammatory burden that accelerates aging across the entire body. The fourth driver is disrupted sleep. This is the one that surprises people most, because sleep is not typically framed as an inflammatory issue, but the evidence is unambiguous. Research published in Sleep has shown that even a single night of significantly disrupted sleep produces measurable rises in inflammatory markers including C-reactive protein and interleukin-6. Chronic sleep disruption, the sustained mild to moderate sleep deprivation that characterizes modern life for tens of millions of adults, maintains those inflammatory markers at a persistently elevated level. Sleep is the period during which the body performs its most essential anti-inflammatory housekeeping, clearing cellular debris, regulating immune activity, repairing tissue damage. When sleep is consistently insufficient or poor in quality, that housekeeping does not happen. The inflammatory debt accumulates night after night. Now that we understand what drives chronic inflammation, we can trace exactly how it produces the specific experiences that people attribute to aging. This is the mechanism that connects the biological cause to the lived reality. The fatigue comes primarily from two sources. First, chronically elevated inflammatory cytokines, particularly interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly suppress mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside every cell, and they are exquisitely sensitive to the inflammatory environment around them. When inflammation is persistently elevated, mitochondrial efficiency declines, cellular energy production falls, and the result is a kind of fatigue that sleep alone does not resolve. Second, a fatigue that sleep alone does not resolve. Inflammation disrupts the HPA axis, the hormonal communication system between the brain, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands, in ways that impair cortisol regulation and contribute to the sense of depleted, unrefreshing energy that so many people in midlife describe. The weight gain, particularly the tendency for fat to accumulate around the abdomen and resist all conventional efforts to shift it, is partly a cause of inflammation and partly a consequence of it. Inflammation impairs the sensitivity of fat cells to insulin, promoting further fat storage. It disrupts the hormonal signals of leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that regulate hunger and fullness, making it physiologically harder to feel satisfied after meals. And it suppresses the production of testosterone and growth hormone, both of which play essential roles in maintaining lean mass and driving fat metabolism. The result is a metabolic environment in which weight gain is the path of least resistance and weight loss requires overcoming a system that is actively working against it. The cognitive fog, the slight but noticeable decline in mental sharpness, recall, and processing speed that many people in midlife attribute to getting older, is one of the most directly inflammation-driven symptoms of all. The brain has its own resident immune cells, called microglia, and when systemic inflammation is elevated, these cells become activated and begin behaving like immune cells rather than the support cells they are designed to be. They generate their own inflammatory signals, disrupt neurotransmitter production, and impair the synaptic plasticity that underlies learning, memory formation, and cognitive flexibility. Research published in JAMA Neurology has found that elevated inflammatory markers in midlife are associated with significantly accelerated cognitive decline over the subsequent 2 decades, suggesting that what people experience as a gradual mental dulling in their 50s and 60s may in many cases be the early expression of inflammation-driven neurological change. If you are finding this useful, please consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps these videos reach more people who need this information. Now, let us continue. Let me name the central problem directly because I think clarity here matters enormously. The mistake, one that is entirely understandable given the information most people have been given, is accepting the symptoms of chronic inflammation as the inevitable consequences of aging, and therefore never addressing the actual cause. This pattern shows up in a way I recognize immediately in clinical practice. Patient in their late 50s comes in not with an acute emergency, but with a constellation of vague overlapping complaints: persistent fatigue, brain fog, joint discomfort, difficulty managing their weight despite reasonable efforts, and a general sense that their body is no longer responding the way it used to. They have mentioned these things to their GP. Each complaint has been investigated individually, found to be within normal limits, attributed to the natural process of getting older. They have been told to exercise more, sleep better, eat less. They are doing their best, and they are still slowly declining. What has not happened, what almost never happens in a standard clinical encounter, is a conversation about the underlying inflammatory burden tying those symptoms together. No one has checked their highly sensitive C-reactive protein, their fasting insulin, or their visceral fat distribution in a meaningful way. No one has connected the dots between their dietary pattern, their sleep quality, their gut health, and the systemic inflammatory state that is producing every symptom on their list. The individual symptoms have been treated as separate, manageable inconveniences. The common cause has gone unaddressed. The less visible dimension of this problem involves the foods that most people consider health neutral or even beneficial. Ultra-processed foods, which now account for more than 50% of caloric intake in the average UK and US diet, are among the most potent drivers of gut microbiome disruption and systemic inflammation available. Many of them contain a class of food additives called emulsifiers, which research published in Nature has shown to directly disrupt the intestinal lining and promote intestinal permeability, the leaky gut mechanism we discussed earlier. Seed oils used in processed food manufacturing, high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, shift the body's inflammatory balance in ways that are measurably detectable in blood markers. Low-fiber diets starve the bacterial species responsible for producing short-chain fatty acids, the compounds that maintain gut lining integrity and regulate immune function. None of these effects are dramatic enough to produce obvious acute symptoms. All of them contribute to the sustained inflammatory environment that erodes vitality over years and decades. The joint pain, the fatigue, the brain fog, the stubborn weight, these did not happen because your body gave up on you. They happened because a specific biological environment was created, sustained over years, and never identified as the problem. The body was not failing. It was responding, predictably and mechanistically, to conditions that were working against it. That is a very different story from aging, and it is a story with a very different ending. I want to frame this carefully. I am not suggesting that inflammation can be eliminated or that the process of aging itself can be stopped. What the evidence supports clearly is that the chronic inflammatory burden most people are carrying is substantially above what is biologically necessary, and that targeted, practical changes can bring it down meaningfully with measurable effects on energy, body composition, cognitive function, and long-term disease risk. The goal is not perfection. It is removing the conditions that are driving inflammation beyond its natural baseline. The single most impactful dietary change for reducing systemic inflammation is reducing ultra-processed food consumption and replacing it with whole food alternatives. This does not require a radical dietary overhaul. It requires a shift in the ratio of processed to unprocessed food across the week. Whole foods, vegetables, fruit, legumes, whole grains, fish, unprocessed meat, nuts, and olive oil provide the fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria, the polyphenols that directly suppress inflammatory signaling pathways, and the omega-3 fatty acids that counterbalance the pro-inflammatory omega-6 excess of modern diets. The Mediterranean dietary pattern is the most extensively studied anti-inflammatory dietary approach in the peer-reviewed literature. Research published in the New England Journal of Medicine demonstrated that adults following a Mediterranean diet, supplemented with olive oil or nuts, showed a 30% reduction in major cardiovascular events over a 5-year period, compared to a low-fat controlled diet. The mechanism is not simply the presence of healthy fats. It is the combined anti-inflammatory effect of high dietary fiber, abundant polyphenols, omega-3 fatty acids, and the reduction in ultra-processed food that the pattern entails. You do not need to follow any single named diet, but moving your eating pattern in the direction of more whole food, more fiber, more oily fish, more olive oil, and less processed and refined food is the most evidence-supported dietary intervention for reducing chronic inflammation that we currently have. Visceral fat, the primary inflammatory organ we identified earlier, responds more readily to exercise than subcutaneous fat. And it responds best not to steady-state cardio but to higher intensity activity, resistance training, and interval training specifically. Both forms of exercise reduce visceral fat more effectively than walking alone, according to research published in obesity reviews. Resistance training additionally increases insulin sensitivity, which reduces the glucose and insulin spikes that drive inflammatory AGAG production. The two interventions work synergistically. Dietary changes reduce the continuous supply of visceral fat, while resistance training and higher intensity movement reduce the existing inflammatory depot and improve the metabolic environment that prevents it from rebuilding. Increasing dietary fiber is the most evidence-supported method of improving microbiome diversity. Fiber is the primary fuel source for the beneficial bacterial species whose metabolic products, short-chain fatty acids, maintain gut lining integrity, regulate immune function, and suppress inflammatory signaling. Research published in Cell Host and Microbe found that increasing dietary fiber intake significantly improved microbiome diversity and reduced markers of intestinal permeability within 4 weeks. Fermented foods, natural yogurt, Kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, and miso have also been shown to increase microbiome diversity and reduce inflammatory markers, with research in Cell demonstrating that a high fermented food diet produced greater improvements in microbiome diversity and greater reductions in systemic inflammatory markers than a high fiber diet alone over a 10-week period. Given that disrupted sleep is a direct measurable driver of inflammatory marker elevation, improving sleep quality is not a lifestyle luxury, it is an anti-inflammatory intervention. The most evidence-supported approaches include maintaining a consistent sleep and wake schedule 7 days a week, reducing light exposure in the 2 hours before sleep, keeping the sleeping environment cool, and addressing the underlying causes of sleep disruption, whether those are stress, alcohol, late meals, or screen use, rather than simply accepting poor sleep as an inevitable part of midlife. I want to be clear that none of these changes replace medical treatment for existing conditions. If you have been diagnosed with an inflammatory condition, cardiovascular disease, or type 2 diabetes, these approaches are complementary to, not substitutes for, the treatment plan your doctor has established. What I am saying is that medication and lifestyle changes are not alternatives. They work better together. And if your symptoms have been attributed to normal aging and no one has ever discussed your inflammatory burden with you, it may be worth specifically requesting a highly sensitive C-reactive protein test and a fasting insulin level at your next appointment and having a conversation about what those numbers mean. Let me bring this back to what I see clinically, because the theoretical case for addressing chronic inflammation only becomes compelling when you see what actually happens when people address it. What I observe and what the research consistently supports is that when the conditions driving chronic inflammation are meaningfully addressed, the response is often faster and more significant than patients expect. Inflammatory markers that have been elevated for years begin to fall within weeks of sustained dietary change. The fatigue that seemed fixed and permanent begins to lift as mitochondrial function improves in a less inflammatory environment. Joint discomfort that had been attributed to irreversible wear and tear reduces as inflammatory cytokines driving that discomfort decline. Cognitive clarity improves as microglial activation, the brain's inflammatory response begins to quiet. I have seen patients who came in convinced they were simply experiencing normal aging, who made targeted changes to their dietary pattern, their sleep, and their activity level, and who came back 3 to 6 months later genuinely surprised by the degree of change. Not because anything magical happened, but because the biological process they had attributed to aging was substantially reversible, and it reversed when the conditions driving it were removed. The biology was not broken, it was responding to an environment that had been working against it. Change the environment and the response changes with it. There are also patients for whom the window is narrower, where the inflammatory damage has been accumulating long enough that meaningful reversal is more limited. That is the honest clinical reality, and it is why this conversation matters more at 50 than at 65, and more at 45 than at 50. The earlier the conditions driving inflammation are identified and addressed, the greater the proportion of the trajectory that remains available to change. This is not a reason for pessimism at any age, it is a reason for urgency. Chronic inflammation is not one disease. It is the biological substrate of most of the diseases that shorten life and degrade its quality in the modern world. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, certain cancers, chronic kidney disease, depression, the common denominator in all of them is a sustained inflammatory environment that the body was never designed to operate in permanently. This is why addressing inflammation does not just improve one symptom or reduce one risk, it shifts the entire biological trajectory. Research published in The Lancet has shown that individuals with low systemic inflammatory markers in midlife have significantly lower rates of virtually every major chronic disease across the subsequent 20 to 30 years, not because of any single intervention, but because the inflammatory substrate that drives those diseases was not present at the level required to initiate and sustain them. When you reduce visceral fat, restore gut health, stabilize glucose, and protect sleep, you are not treating one problem. You are withdrawing the conditions under which most modern disease develops. Think of it as adjusting the thermostat in a building, not fixing one room, but changing the temperature of the entire environment. Every system in the building responds. The health gains are not additive, they are multiplicative, because the underlying process driving multiple downstream conditions has been addressed at its root. That is what it means to treat what is actually happening, rather than accepting it as aging. Aging is real, and it is inevitable. But the rate at which you age biologically, the speed at which your cells, tissues, and organs accumulate damage, is substantially modifiable. And the most powerful lever available for modifying it is the inflammatory environment your body operates in every day. So let me bring this full circle. The fatigue, the cognitive fog, the weight that will not shift, the joint discomfort, the sense that your body is not responding the way it once did, these experiences are real. But they are not, in the majority of cases, simply the inevitable cost of getting older. They are the lived experience of chronic low-grade inflammation, a specific measurable biological process that is being driven by specific modifiable conditions: visceral fat, gut microbiome disruption, blood glucose instability, disrupted sleep, the ultra-processed dietary environment of modern life. These drivers were not part of the human environment for most of our evolutionary history. The body was not designed to operate in them permanently, and when those conditions are changed, when inflammation is addressed at its source rather than its symptoms, the response the body produces is often remarkable and often faster than people dare to hope. You are not simply aging. You are living in conditions that are accelerating a biological process that does not have to run at the rate it is running. That is a very different situation, and it is one that leaves a great deal more in your hands than the word aging implies. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe to the channel and help this information reach more people who need it.